organizing this event. When I first saw the heartbreaking photos of the utter chaos and the humanitarian crisis that pursued after the Taliban reclaimed control of Afghanistan, I knew this event could not go unnoticed. Like most of us, I was not born when 9/11 occurred and was only a few days old when the war in Afghanistan began. It is important for us to be here because we cannot call ourselves Thessalians, people who care about social justice and the poor, if we let the human rights violations of the Taliban go unnoticed. Like Howard Zinn, I believe that small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. If you see today on most of your seats, there's a pamphlet that says get involved. There's 5 simple ways that us Manhattan College students can get involved. One of which is you could donate to a GoFundMe created by a fraternity here in Joseph Talenti. There's a QR code that you could scan and donate. HGI is having a bath and toiletry supply drive that you currently can donate supply items to, located in O'Malley 504. Along with that, there's countless organizations that you can volunteer at, donate furniture, etc. And I encourage all of us here at Manhattan College, a campus that believes in social justice, to get involved. And with that being said, I thank all of you for being here today and showing that you care about this issue. And I'm going to pass it to Dr. Takla, who will talk about the history of the Afghanistan conflict.
No, we have it. Hang on, give me a sec. What's yours called? Download. All right. I'm seeing it. It's buried, hold on. You see the slideshow?
Okay.
Yeah.
There's like a button here. This right there.
That one. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My apologies for that delay. So I first want to say many thanks to Chris for organizing this event and inviting me to speak. My name is Dr. Nefertiti Takla, and I'm a historian of the modern Middle East here at Manhattan College. So I want to begin this talk by first addressing 3 common misconceptions that I have heard throughout my years of teaching. The first common misconception is the notion that Afghanistan is part of the Middle East. Afghanistan is actually considered part of Central Asia, not the Middle East. This means that scholars who are trained in Middle East history are usually not experts on Afghanistan. Some people have argued that this division of the world into separate units is largely based on imperialist interests, but unfortunately these divisions still shape our training as scholars. The second common misconception is the notion that countries with a Muslim majority have Muslim governments. That's not true. The reality is that many Muslim majority countries are actually secular. Most of them don't enforce Sharia law, and most of them don't force women to veil, especially in the Western half, like what is the Middle East as opposed to Central Asia. Furthermore, many Muslims have a preference for secular governance. I think when I teach Middle East history, people are sometimes surprised to hear that. Across the Middle East and Central Asia, there are actually many different opinions about what role religion should or should not play in governance. And these opinions change depending on the time and place. So for example, the Muslim Brotherhood was elected into power right after the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, and then they were ousted from power a year later. These opinions can change also quite rapidly. The third common misconception is the notion that Islamist governments like the Taliban are a relic of the past. This is also not true. There is a big difference between the Islamic empires that existed in the past and the Islamist governments today. Historic Muslim empires were often tolerant of religious communities, religious minorities, excuse me, and with a few exceptions, they did not violently impose Sharia law on those who did not want it. This is very different from the way Islamist regimes like the Taliban operate today. Islamism is therefore not a return to the past. It is a modern political movement that emerged in the 20th century as a reaction to Western imperialism. It is a movement that seeks governance based on Islamic principles, but these Islamic principles are different from the principles of historic Muslim empires, and they're different from how Muslims perceive, well, many Muslims perceive their religion today, right? So we don't want to conflate Islam and Islamism, right? These are two separate things. For this reason, it would be inaccurate to call Islamist regimes Muslim governments, and scholars are careful to call them Islamist governments in order to distinguish them both from historic Muslim empires and the Muslim religion. In the rest of my talk, I will focus on two central questions. One, what role have external powers played in the history of Afghanistan? And two, how did external powers contribute to the emergence of the Taliban and its rise to power? As many scholars would argue, to understand the current crisis in Afghanistan, we should begin with the Anglo-Afghan wars in the mid-1800s. Although the area we call Afghanistan was not formally colonized by European powers, it was a victim of British imperialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Given its strategic geographic location between the Russian Empire and British-ruled India, so that area in yellow there, the British feared that Russia planned to expand into Afghanistan in order to invade India, and the Russians feared that the British were planning to expand into Central Asia. So this British-Russian rivalry and paranoia was known as the Great Game. In the end, it was only the British who invaded Afghanistan in the 19th century. Although their first attempt to control Afghanistan in the mid-1800s ended in a terrible defeat for the British, they invaded again in 1878. This second Anglo-Afghan war ended with a treaty that gave Britain control over Afghanistan's foreign policy. Consequently, Afghanistan was considered a semi-independent state until the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919, which ultimately led to full independence for Afghanistan. Both the wars and the treaty had consequences for Afghanistan. In addition to the devastating effects of war in general, the Anglo-Afghan wars empowered the religious establishment and tribal leaders because they were the ones who mobilized the population to fight against the British. At the same time, the treaty with Britain ensured that the Afghan ruler was dependent on the support of not only the people of Afghanistan, but also the British. These circumstances made it difficult to build a centralized state, leading to conflicts between the ruler on the one hand and clergy and tribal leaders on the other. Rulers initially dealt with this by using brutal methods to repress opposition, while subsequent rulers adopted a policy of appeasement. Appeasement included, for example, giving clergy a degree of control over the curriculum of state schools in the first half of the 20th century. After World War II, with the growth of an educated middle class, Afghan rulers decided to end their policy of appeasing the religious establishment. The Afghan government even gave tacit support to a new liberal nationalist party called the Awakened Youth Party, which advocated constitutionalism and an end to the power of the religious establishment and tribal leaders. The party's open criticism of the government eventually resulted in its banishment in the early 1950s. And some scholars have argued that this crackdown on liberal nationalists enabled the rise of radical political groups in Afghanistan, paving the way for violent conflict between Marxists and Islamists 2 decades later. The conflict between Marxists and Islamists in Afghanistan also stemmed from the Afghan government's closer alliance with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Beginning in the 1950s, the government accepted large amounts of aid from the Soviet Union, which angered the religious establishment. In 1965, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, known as PDPA, emerged as the first Marxist-Leninist political party in the country. Interestingly, a number of the leaders who had previously belonged to the liberal nationalist Awaken Youth Party, or a number of the leaders of this party had previously belonged to the Liberal Nationalist Party. So in the 1970s, relations with the Soviet Union soured, leading the PDPA to overthrow the government in 1978 and align it more closely with the Soviet Union. The new president, Nur Muhammad Taraki, immediately began making sweeping changes, leading to revolts across the country. 1 year later, Islamist fighters known as the Mujahideen began to take control of regions in northern Afghanistan. The Soviet Union sent military aid to quell the uprisings, while the US began sending aid to the Mujahideen, quickly turning this into a proxy war. In September 1979, Taraki was overthrown by his prime minister and then killed. His murder prompted the Soviet Union to formally invade and occupy Afghanistan in December 1979, marking the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War. The Soviet Union became the new face of Western imperialism in Afghanistan, attracting Islamist fighters from all over the region. What may surprise us now is that the US was not shy about its support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. This is an image of Ronald Reagan sitting in the White House with the Mujahideen, praising them as freedom fighters. Yet actual US military aid to the Mujahideen was sent covertly through Pakistan. The US sent approximately $9 billion in aid, supplying the Mujahideen with increasingly advanced weaponry so that by the second half of the war, they were shooting down Soviet helicopters. Like most proxy wars at this time, the Soviet-Afghan War had devastating consequences on the population. By the mid-1980s, there were at least 3 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan, 1.5 million in Iran, and hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people. In addition to that, after the Soviet Union withdrew its last troops from Afghanistan in 1989, multiple civil wars broke out. The first was between the government and the Mujahideen, and it ended with the establishment of the Islamic State of Afghanistan. The second civil war was between the Islamic State and rival Mujahideen groups, and it ended with the establishment of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which was established by the Taliban in 1996. The third war was between supporters of the Islamic State versus the Islamic Emirate. So the Taliban, which my colleagues will say more about, emerged from among the many different Mujahideen groups in the midst of the civil war. By 1998, the Taliban had captured 90% of the country, and some people welcomed them because they brought a degree of order and stability after many years of fighting. But that order and stability came at a very high cost. They inflicted brutal punishments, enforced gender segregation and strict dress codes for men and women, and many women lost their jobs and their ability to get an education. They also gave safe refuge to Mujahideen who had come from other countries during the Soviet-Afghan War, such as Osama bin Laden, which hurt the Taliban's relationship with the United States. In the midst of the war, bin Laden had established an international organization called Al-Qaeda that was dedicated to ending Western political and cultural influence on Muslim countries. Al-Qaeda began to operate in many Muslim countries. And as we see in this newspaper article from 1993, bin Laden and his followers traveled to places like Sudan to build roads, businesses, and Al-Qaeda training camps. In 1996, bin Laden declared a jihad on the United States, and the CIA began making covert efforts to capture him. The following year, CNN managed to conduct an interview with bin Laden in which he explained why he declared jihad on the US. This is a screenshot from that interview. You can actually find it on YouTube.
Yeah.
The main reasons he gave were US military presence in Saudi Arabia, economic sanctions imposed on Iraq, and US support for Israel. He ended the interview with a warning to the US. And 4 years later, he made good on his threat with the 9/11 attacks. And at that point, I will leave to Dr. Pam Chasik.
Yeah, I can.
Or do you want me to?
Just stop.
I'm just. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming this afternoon. My name is Pam Chasik. I am a professor of political science in our political science, not government, department. And my focus is on international relations and particularly US foreign policy. So I'm going to pick up where Dr. Takwa left off with this from the point of view of US foreign policy during the period from 9/11 until the present, and see if I can do so in 7 minutes. So 20 years, 7 minutes, let's go. So 3 days after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, President George W. Bush came to New York. He climbed upon a pile of smoldering rubble downtown, and he addressed a large number of first responders. They paused in their work to welcome him to New York. These attacks, as Dr. Takwa said, not only attacked the World Trade Center, but also the Pentagon and a field outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing nearly 3,000 people. It was the worst, most deadliest terrorist attack on US soil ever. Just 3 weeks after President Bush came to New York, US-led forces invaded Afghanistan. The target was Osama bin Laden, as well as the Taliban government that sheltered him and his followers. It was a pretty easy target for the United States because at that point, really only 4 governments around the world recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. So it was a fairly simple, in foreign policy terms, target for the United States. By December 2001, the US military toppled the Taliban, destroyed al-Qaeda's training camps, and killed or caught many of its fighters. From their hideouts in the mountains of southern Afghanistan, Taliban leaders tried to surrender to the United States, but US commanders rejected that offer because they were sure they could destroy the group completely. The bad news, however, was that Osama bin Laden and his top lieutenant managed to escape across the border into Pakistan. With Afghanistan now in American hands, NATO members, NATO supported us, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization supported us because under Article 5 of NATO, an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all NATO members. So, NATO forces contributed both combat and support troops to the occupation, making it a broader Western war against terrorism. But in April 2002, President Bush delivered a speech that would change the course of the conflict. He called for Afghanistan's reconstruction, including the creation of a stable democratic government, a national army, an economy that was not reliant on the cultivation and sale of opium, and an educational system for both boys and girls. Congress soon appropriated $38 billion to fund this nation-building effort. So the war shifted from a war against terrorism to a nation-building process. And American and NATO troops soon learned that the war was just beginning. With Pakistani help, the Taliban regrouped and waged a deadly guerrilla campaign against the latest in a long line of foreign occupiers, as described by Dr. Takwa. As American casualties mounted over the ensuing years, the US military's initial victory began to evaporate. Even before President Obama came into office in 2008, officials were warning that the Afghanistan government's corruption and incompetence were breeding popular discontent across the country. And thanks to support from Pakistan, the Taliban was growing stronger. But the public was told progress was being made. In fact, consistently, Pentagon officials and others would tell the public, we are making progress in building a stable Afghanistan. On May 2nd, 2011, Obama had some good news for the nation. A team of US Navy SEALs had killed bin Laden at his hideout in Pakistan. But this had little impact on the war in Afghanistan, although it was received with great excitement here in the United States. If anything, the number of attacks on US troops increased as jihadis sought to avenge bin Laden's death. So when it comes to foreign policy, as everything else, Congress is supposed to have oversight authority. But Congress did not exercise much oversight on all of the billions of dollars that we were pouring into Afghanistan. In fact, over 20 years, the Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, which was responsible for appropriating funds for the war, held only 5 hearings to review the mounting costs of the Afghanistan conflict. This lack of congressional oversight allowed a kleptocracy to form among Afghan authorities that undermined the entire US strategy. By allowing corruption to fester, the US helped destroy the popular legitimacy of this wobbly Afghanistan government that they were fighting to prop up. With judges and police chiefs and bureaucrats extorting bribes left and right, many Afghans became sour on democracy, and they turned to the Taliban to enforce order, once again repeating history. What became obvious also when the country fell to the Taliban in August this past year, the US military also failed in its $88 billion effort to train the Afghanistan army and police. Obama was unable to withdraw, but President Trump wanted to. President Trump wanted to meet with the Taliban at Camp David on the anniversary of 9/11 in 2019. He was focused on his art of the deal, but he didn't realize how short-sighted this approach was. The Taliban said the only way they'd make any deal with the United States is if the Afghan government was not part of the deal. To create the deal, Trump administration said, fine, we'll just negotiate with the Taliban. So what they ended up doing was that the United States just abandoned this democratically elected government that it had been propping up for 19 years to create this deal. And without active involvement of the Afghan government and without a sustained commitment to supporting this elected Afghan government, it set the stage for this very messy withdrawal that we saw in August. President Trump agreed to a May 1st, 2021 withdrawal, but as we all know, Joe Biden won the election in 2020 and inherited this May 1st withdrawal date. He decided to delay the date that he inherited, but ultimately his administration pushed ahead with a plan to withdraw by August 31st. I will not go into it, but if you have questions, I will about, President Biden had been against the war in Afghanistan for quite some time, and getting out of Afghanistan after 20 years was a priority of his. But there were signs that Taliban wasn't complying with the agreement and that they already had a stated goal to create an Islamic government in Afghanistan. Biden assured the American public that the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan was not inevitable, and he denied that US intelligence assessed that the Afghan government would likely collapse, but it did, and quicker than anyone could have imagined. So to wrap up, it took 4 presidencies for America to abandon Afghanistan. George W. Bush's attention wandered soon after American special forces rode in horseback through the northern mountains and the first schoolgirls gathered in freezing classrooms. Barack Obama, after studying the problem for months, poured in troops and pulled them out in an ambivalent gesture, whose goal was to keep the war on page A13, not basically off the front pages of the paper. Donald Trump cut a deal with the Taliban that left the future of the Afghan government, Afghan women, and Al-Qaeda to fate. By then, most Americans were barely aware that the war was still going on. It fell to Joe Biden to complete the task. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's me, yeah. Hi, I'm Liz Nelson, also a professor in the political science department, also focusing on international relations issues and human rights in particular. So I'm going to be speaking to you briefly today about human rights issues in Afghanistan primarily as they relate to women, although the issues are much broader than that, certainly. Okay, so as soon as it became clear that the Taliban were going to take over the government in Afghanistan, alarm bells were ringing, certainly among folks in Afghanistan and also in the rights community beyond. This wasn't an introduction to what a Taliban government could look like, since the Taliban had been in power before, right? So between 1996 and 2001, we'd seen a Taliban government, and this had been a particularly dark period for women and girls during this time. So during that period, many women were barred from going to work, many girls were barred from going to school. There were strict restrictions on what women could wear, where they could go, and generally their ability to participate in public life. Okay, so in the initial weeks after the Taliban gained power, there was rhetoric on behalf of the Taliban that this would somehow be different, that this would be a different looking Taliban government. They would introduce a representative or inclusive government, and that their views on women's rights in particular had evolved. It soon became clear, if it hadn't been clear already, that this was not going to be the case. This was not going to be matched by reality on the ground. And I think that all of those people who fled Afghanistan at the time and all of those people who tried to flee Afghanistan at the time are indicative of these and greater concerns. Right? So there were a couple of things that happened initially that sort of pointed to the direction in which the Taliban were going. The first was when they unveiled their caretaker government. It was filled with Taliban members from the previous regime, which indicated there was going to be a lot of continuity. And another sort of early indication of what was to come was the Taliban decision to dismantle the Ministry for Women's Affairs, which was the body that was created or had been created to promote and protect women's rights. And it was effectively replaced by the Ministry the promotion of virtue and prevention of vice. This was the body that in the past had been really responsible for monitoring residents' behavior and had beaten women for violating dress codes or the prohibition on education and employment. So this was just the beginning. And after this, we start to see a number of increased restrictions on women's activities. So a former senior judge, I have a quote here, I think it's important to hear the voices of the women from Afghanistan and not just mine, right? But the former senior judge in Afghanistan Supreme Court, Fawzia Amini, has said, the Taliban have institutionalized discrimination against women. They are denying our fundamental rights. They want to wipe women from the face of society and make us all prisoners in our own homes. That's courtesy of Amnesty International. So what does that mean today on the ground? Well, apart from healthcare workers, apart from elementary school teachers, and some very limited, isolated exceptions, women are essentially told not to come to work anymore. Girls above the age of 12 most girls above the age of 12 haven't been able to attend school since mid-September. Right? Rigid segregation rules in higher education have made it very difficult for women to pursue further education and continue studies at universities. And in terms of travel, for some travel, women are not allowed to go alone and must have a chaperone with them. Throughout all of this, we are seeing an increase in the Taliban's attempts to suppress and silence women's voices who are speaking up against these violations. So censorship has increased. What the media can report on is very limited now. Journalists have been arrested and detained. Peaceful protesters for women's rights have been arrested, have been beaten, and a number of women's rights activists have disappeared or been disappeared, maybe is another word I should use. I should also add just that Afghanistan is made up of 34 different provinces. And so there is some variation in terms of the experiences on the ground and the ways in which some of these restrictions are implemented and enforced. So generalizations are always a little bit tricky. But that said, I do think that there's sort of the level of ambiguity in terms of interpretation of some of these rules amid this culture of fear does allow for some generalizations. Right? So for example, the Taliban at the national level have said that women need to have a male chaperone if they're going to travel for certain periods of time, like over 3 days or certain distances over 45 miles. But at local levels, there's been a lot of pressure been put on taxi drivers to not accept women if they're alone, period, no matter where they're going or for how long. Some women have said they don't want to leave the house without a male chaperone because they're afraid of what's going to happen if they're confronted by Taliban on the street. Some male doctors have expressed fear over treating women patients, right? So this culture of fear has certainly shifted the way things look on the ground, regardless of some variations in terms of the implementation. All right. So all of these restrictions have affected women's rights, women's freedoms to association, to expression, to movement. They've limited their ability to earn income, access to education, access to healthcare in some instances. And a lot of these consequences are far worse in cases where women might have been the primary breadwinners or sole breadwinners, or women who are unmarried. Okay? And all of these issues are happening within a broader context of a political crisis and an increasingly devastating humanitarian one. So in terms of the politics, or at least the political capacity in Afghanistan, so many of the workers from the previous Afghan government have fled or are afraid to return to work for how they're going to be treated by the Taliban, that the Taliban have removed so many women workers from government. This has left a great hole in its ability to govern at all. That's just the political side, but the humanitarian crisis is even worse, coming from all kinds of other areas. So prior to the Taliban takeover, 80% of the Afghan government's budget had come from international aid and donors, which stopped, right? Either immediately before the Taliban took over or soon after. Some of that is trickling in, but it's the impact has been immediate. That, along with sanctions, has ensured that there are higher food prices, a run on banks, a run on cash. And so hunger and poverty is essentially affecting almost everyone in Afghanistan today. So I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up quickly, but the UN World Food Program has issued multiple warnings of worsening food insecurity and the risk of large-scale deaths from hunger throughout Afghanistan. So this humanitarian crisis, packed within a political crisis, in the context of a massively devastating humanitarian crisis, has made life incredibly difficult for the population of Afghanistan, particularly their most vulnerable members. Thank you.
Thank
Everyone, Kevin Ahern, I'm a professor in the Religious Studies department here, and I just want to, especially like others, thank Chris, who initiated this panel, and say to the students that are here, this is an effort that was created by students, or at least an effort that a student idea resulted in this. So if you have ideas of how we as a college can respond to other things, don't hesitate to bring them forward. And we're always, I think I speak for my colleagues here and others here, we're always happy to support student initiatives. So I was asked the question to try to address how might our identity as a Lasallian Catholic College encourage us to respond, or how might we respond as a Lasallian Catholic College? Or what does this identity that we say we have lead us to do to respond to this huge humanitarian crisis? And so I'm going to turn to a recent text by Pope Francis, which he issued in 2020, an encyclical letter for Fratelli Tutti, or brothers and sisters all. This document offers, I believe, 3 insights that might help us to shape our response following the longest war in human history. First and foremost, or in the United States history. First and foremost, Pope Francis reminds us of a fundamental reality. All of us, no matter what race, religion, or nationality, all of us are brothers and sisters. One of his first major actions as Pope, in fact, was in 2013, where he went to the small Italian island of Lampedusa to respond to the plight of migrants and refugees fleeing other wars in the Mediterranean. And a ship had sunk, and so Pope Francis was really moved by the deaths of these migrants in this rickety ships. And so he goes there, and this is his first official visit as Pope. And he says, and he uses the biblical story of Cain and Abel to remind us that we are all each other's brothers and sisters, that these refugees that are flowing are our brothers and sisters as much as anyone who shares our same passport. In Fratelli Tutti in 2020, Pope Francis's focus is on another biblical account, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this is quoting the Pope here. Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan in answer to the question, who is my neighbor? The word neighbor in the society of Jesus's time usually meant those nearest to us. it was felt that help should be given primarily to those of one's own group and race. For some Jews of that time, Samaritans were looked down upon and considered impure. They were not among those to be helped. Jesus, himself a Jew, completely transforms this approach. He asks us not to decide who is close enough to be our neighbor, but rather that we ourselves become neighbors to all. Concerned and about the perceived and real tensions between Muslims, Christians, and Jews worldwide, Pope Francis, in fact, devotes an entire chapter in Fratelli Tutti to siblinghood across religious traditions. This leads to a question for me. Do we at Manhattan College encourage a sense of siblinghood across borders? In the face of suffering, do we inspire each other to be good Samaritans or passive bystanders? Within the framework of universal siblinghood, some of our sisters and brothers deserve special attention, and this brings us to a second theme, a preferential option for the migrants and the refugees. Building on the teachings in the Gospel of Matthew and the Judgment of the Nations, Christians have long identified that in refugees and migrants, one can see and find God in a special way. The war in Afghanistan displaced over 5 million people, 2.6 million of them, men, women, and children, and most of them below the age of 18, join over 20 million others who have been forced to flee their home countries from various places in the world. This is a massive humanitarian disaster. In the Catholic tradition, all human beings have a right and sometimes a responsibility to migrate and seek safety across borders. Quote, "We are obliged," as Francis says, "to respect the right of all individuals to find a place that meets their basic needs and those of their families, and where they can find personal fulfillment. Our response to the arrival of migrating persons can be summarized by 4 words. This is Pope Francis again. Welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. Welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. A major battle to care for the refugee and the stranger, as Pope Francis recognizes, is what he calls the virus of racism. This disease is increasingly fueled by populist and nationalist political figures who try to exploit fears for political gain. Right? Images at Westchester County Airport are being used by people running for office in New York State to say we should be afraid of refugees and migrants coming into Westchester County, for example. Fratelli Tutti strongly rejects this. For Christians, Pope Francis insists, this way of thinking and acting is unacceptable since it sets certain political preferences above deep convictions of our faith, the inalienable dignity of each person, regardless of origin, race, or religion, and the supreme law of fraternal love. How is Manhattan College welcoming refugees to our campus? How can we better serve refugees in our mission of education? Can we do something specific for those people, those refugees from the Afghan crisis? Considering the root causes of forced displacement leads to a third theme raised by Pope Francis, the urgent need for a critical reappraisal of war. In recent years, Catholic social teaching has expanded the traditional categories of the so-called just war tradition to include a new category of use post bellum. Traditionally, just war tradition looks at war, going to war, use ad bellum, justice in war, use in bello. But recently, we've been asking this question, what happens when a war is over? What do we do? What are the ethical, moral questions and responsibilities that happen once a war ends? Rebuilding, protecting civilians. But Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti takes us to another level. Towards the end of it, he offers the strongest critique of the legitimacy of war by any pope. We can no longer, quote, we can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war, never again war. A few paragraphs later, Pope Francis urges that we take time to engage refugees directly, to quote, look at the reality through their eyes and listen with an open heart to stories they tell. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil that is at the heart of war. So with that, I think Pope Francis offers us a good invitation to actually listen to the experience of people who've been impacted by war, and what does that do to how we become peacemakers in our own lives and our own communities? Thank you.